Blood dripped from Gabriel's knuckles as he stared at the trembling, plus-sized woman weeping on his Persian rug. She wasn't supposed to be here, but when she finally choked out the words, "My father," and "my brother did that," the city's most ruthless kingpin didn't reach for his gun. He reached for his phone to order a massacre. Clara Davies had spent her entire 26 years trying to shrink a cruel irony for a woman whose body naturally commanded space. She was fat a word her father Richard and her older brother Jonathan wielded like a serrated blade whenever they needed to carve away her self-esteem. They had convinced her long ago that her weight made her unlovable a burden to the family and a grotesque stain on the polished image of Davies' logistics. Because of this, Clara was kept hidden. She was the ghost in the machine working 60-hour weeks in the damp, windowless basement office of their Chicago warehouse, balancing ledgers, managing payroll, and desperately trying to keep the family business afloat, while Richard and Jonathan squandered their profits on high-stakes poker and luxury cars. Clara accepted her lot. She believed the poisonous lie that, because she didn't fit the world's narrow standard of beauty, she owed her family her relentless, invisible labor just to justify her existence. But loyalty, Clara was about to learn, was a one-way street in the Davies family. It happened on a torrential Tuesday night in November. Clara was hunched over a glowing monitor, her thick thighs pressing against the cold metal of her desk, frantically trying to find a missing $2 million in the quarterly accounts. The numbers weren't just wrong. They had been deliberately scrubbed. Panic fluttered in her chest, tight and suffocating. Before she could pick up the phone to call her father, the heavy steel door of the basement office groaned open. Footsteps echoed down the concrete stairs. Not just two pairs, but several. Heavy, deliberate, and ominous. Richard and Jonathan descended first, their faces pale clothes, soaked from the rain. But it was the men behind them that made Clara's blood run cold. 3 men in immaculate, dark-tailored suits, moving with the terrifying, silent grace of apex predators. At the center was Gabriel Marino. Gabriel was a phantom in the criminal underworld, the head of the Marino Syndicate. He was brutally handsome, with sharp, aristocratic features, jet-black hair, and eyes the color of a frozen lake. His reputation was etched in blood across the eastern seaboard, a man who didn't just destroy his enemies, but erased their entire bloodlines. Richard. Gabriel's voice was a low, resonant baritone that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the basement. "You said you had my collateral. This is a basement full of dust and cheap electronics." Richard swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. He refused to look at Clara. Instead, he pointed a trembling finger directly at her. "There, that's her. That's the collateral." Clara froze, her hands hovering over her keyboard. "Dad, what? What is going on?" Jonathan stepped forward, a cruel, mocking sneer twisting his lips. He looked at Gabriel, then back at his sister, his eyes dripping with disgust. "She's the sole owner of the offshore holding accounts, Mr. Marino. We set them up in her name. If you want your money back, she's the only one who can authorize the transfer. Take her. Keep her until it clears. Honestly, take the pig. She's got enough meat on her bones to survive a few winters in your cellar." The sheer brutality of the words struck Clara with the force of a physical blow. Her breath hitched, tears instantly pooling in her eyes. She looked at her father, begging silently for him to contradict Jonathan, to tell them it was a sick joke. Richard finally met her gaze, his eyes dead and cowardly. "I'm sorry, Clara. We had no choice. You owe us for putting a roof over your head all these years." Gabriel Marino didn't blink. His cold eyes swept over Clara. He saw her plus-sized frame, her worn, oversized cardigan, the terrified trembling of her bottom lip. He was accustomed to collateral beautiful mistresses, arrogant sons, prized racehorses. He had never been handed a terrified broken woman who looked as though her own family had already shattered her soul into 1,000 pieces. "Take her!" Gabriel commanded his men quietly. When the two enforcers stepped forward, Clara didn't fight. The betrayal was so absolute, so profoundly deep that it paralyzed her. As cold steel handcuffs were locked around her thick wrists, biting into her skin, she realized the horrifying truth. Her family hadn't just used her as collateral. They had thrown her to the wolves, hoping she would be devoured so they could escape. As she was dragged up the stairs, Jonathan's laugh echoed in the stairwell. "Don't feed her too much, Marino. She'll eat you out of house and home." Clara squeezed her eyes shut, letting the darkness take over as the cold rain of the Chicago night washed over her face, her father's cowardly silence ringing louder than the thunder. The Marino estate was a sprawling Gothic fortress nestled in the isolated hills outside the city. Clara was not thrown into a damp dungeon as her brother had cruelly predicted. Instead, she was placed in a sterile, high-security guest room. It had no windows, only smooth grey walls, a heavy mahogany desk and a simple bed. For 2 days, Clara sat in the corner of the room, her arms wrapped around her knees, refusing to eat the meals brought to her by silent guards. The silence was deafening, leaving her alone with the agonizing realization of her reality. She was a hostage of the Mafia, but worse, she was a discarded piece of trash to the only people she had ever loved. The psychological torment of her weight, the years of being called a worthless fat burden, culminated in this room. She truly believed her life was over. On the evening of the 3rd day, the heavy door unlatched with a loud clack. Gabriel Marino walked in. He had removed his suit jacket, wearing only a black dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and dark, intricate tattoos. He pulled out the chair from the desk and sat backward on it, crossing his arms over the backrest. He stared at her for a long, calculating minute. Clara pressed herself harder into the corner, pulling her oversized sweater down over her knees, trying desperately to hide her body to become invisible. $2 million, Clara. Gabriel started his voice, a low, dangerous rumble. That is what your father and brother stole from my shipments. They told me you are the sole signatory on the Panamanian accounts where the money is stashed. Give me the authorization codes, and I will put you on a bus anywhere in the country. Refuse and things become unpleasant. Clara's voice was a ragged, broken whisper, rough from days of disuse and crying. I don't know what you're talking about. Gabriel's eyes narrowed. Do not play stupid with me. I am not a patient man. I'm not playing stupid. Clara suddenly sobbed, the dam finally breaking. She looked up at him, her face red and tear-stained. I'm the accountant for the legitimate freight. I balance the books for the local deliveries. I don't know anything about Panamanian accounts. I don't know anything about your shipments. Gabriel stood up slowly, kicking the chair aside. He walked toward her, crouching down so he was eye level with her on the floor. His physical presence was suffocating, terrifying. Your brother said you set up the accounts. He showed me the digital signatures. They match yours. They forged them. Clara cried out, her chest heaving. The sheer injustice of it all ripped through her fear, replacing it with a hysterical, desperate anger. They forged my signature. Don't you see what they did? They stole your money, and they pinned it on me. Gabriel stared at her, unblinking. Clara dragged a trembling hand through her tangled hair. They've hated me my entire life. They hid me in the basement because I was too fat to be seen by the clients. They verbally abused me every single day, telling me I was worthless, that no one would ever want me, that I was just a disgusting pig. She choked on a sob, the traumatic words burning her throat as she said them out loud to this terrifying stranger. When they realized you were going to kill them for the missing money, they set me up. If you kill me, the trail goes cold. You'll think the money died with me, and they get to walk away free." She squeezed her eyes shut, preparing for the blow, preparing for the Mafia boss to call her a liar, to strike her to end it all right there. "My father and my brother did that," she whispered, her voice breaking into a million jagged pieces. "They didn't give me to you as collateral, Mr. Marino. They gave me to you to be the scapegoat. So just do it. Just kill me. I have nothing left anyway." Silence stretched in the room. It was heavy, thick, and suffocating. Clara waited for the bullet. She waited for the cold hands of a killer. Instead, she felt a sudden strange warmth. She opened her eyes and gasped. Gabriel Marino, the ruthless, cold-blooded executioner of the underworld, was reaching out. His large, calloused hand gently brushed a tear from her cheek. His touch was shockingly tender, a stark contrast to the violence that usually lived in his hands. Gabriel's jaw was clenched so tight, a muscle ticked violently in his cheek. The cold, icy detachment in his blue eyes had shattered, replaced by a dark, terrifying inferno of pure rage. But the rage wasn't directed at her. He looked at Clara, at her plus-sized frame, hunched in defensive terror, at the deep, agonizing wounds of familial betrayal carved into her expression, and something fundamental inside the Mafia boss snapped. Gabriel knew betrayal. He lived in a world built on lies and deceit. But the profound, sickening cruelty of a father and brother, mentally torturing their own flesh and blood, tearing down a woman because of her weight, and then offering her up to a monster just to save their own cowardly skins. It disgusted him on a visceral level. He looked at Clara's trembling lips, her deep brown eyes wide with shock at his gentle touch. She was beautiful, he realized suddenly. Beneath the oversized defensive clothing and the crushing weight of her family's abuse, there was a raw, resilient beauty that Richard and Jonathan were too blind and arrogant to see. Gabriel slowly stood up, his eyes never leaving hers. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Mr. Marino!" Clara whispered, terrified by the sudden shift in the room's energy. Gabriel pressed a button on his phone, holding it to his ear. When his lieutenant answered, Gabriel's voice was the sound of a guillotine blade dropping. "Find Richard and Jonathan Davies." Gabriel commanded, his eyes locked onto Clara's, promising a terrifying, unholy retribution. "Drag them out of whatever hole they are hiding in. Do not kill them. I want them brought to the warehouse. They are going to learn what happens when you throw your own blood to the wolves." He hung up the phone and looked back down at Clara, extending a hand toward her. "You are no longer a hostage." "Clara," Gabriel said softly, the lethal promise in his voice sending shivers down her spine. "You are going to be my queen. And tonight, you are going to watch your family burn." Clara had never known what it felt like to be seen, truly undeniably seen, until the next evening. For her entire life, her body had been a cage constructed by the cruel words of Richard and Jonathan Davies. But Gabriel Marino treated her as if she were a Renaissance masterpiece. Hours before they were scheduled to leave for the warehouse, a team of high-end, discreet tailors arrived at her suite. They didn't sneer at her measurements or offer backhanded compliments. Instead, they draped her in a custom, deep crimson silk dress that wrapped perfectly around her waist and cascaded over her thick thighs. For the first time, Clara looked in the floor-to-length mirror and didn't see a fat, worthless burden. She saw a statuesque, imposing woman. She saw power. Gabriel waited at the bottom of the grand staircase. When he looked up and saw Clara descending, his breath visibly hitched. He didn't offer a polite, empty compliment. He simply walked to the foot of the stairs, took her hand, and kissed her knuckles. "They tried to bury a diamond in the dirt," he murmured, his blue eyes flashing with a possessive dark pride. "Tonight we show them exactly what you are worth. The ride to the Marino Syndicate's private shipping docks was executed in heavy, tense silence. Rain lashed against the tinted windows of the armored SUV, mirroring the storm brewing in Clara's chest. She was terrified, yet beneath the fear, a dormant, white-hot ember of vengeance had finally sparked to life. When the heavy steel doors of the warehouse rolled open, the smell of brine, rust, and damp concrete filled the air. At the center of the cavernous room, illuminated by harsh industrial floodlights, sat Richard and Jonathan. They were bound to steel chairs, their expensive tailored suits torn and stained with grease and blood. 3 of Gabriel's heavily armed enforcers stood in the shadows, silent as statues. As Gabriel and Clara stepped into the circle of light, Richard's head snapped up. His eyes widened in absolute shock. He expected Gabriel. He did not expect Clara radiating a fierce, untouchable dignity in her crimson dress, standing shoulder to shoulder with the most feared man in the city. Clara. Richard gasped, his voice raspy and broken. Jonathan scoffed, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the concrete, his arrogance refusing to die even in the face of death. Look at you dressing up the pig merino. What is this? You think putting lipstick on her changes the fact that she's a pathetic... Gabriel didn't yell. He didn't even blink. He simply flicked his wrist. An enforcer stepped forward from the shadows and drove a heavy combat boot directly into Jonathan's knee. The sickening crack of bone echoed through the warehouse, instantly followed by Jonathan's agonizing, piercing scream. "Every time you insult her," Gabriel said, his voice a low, terrifying hum that carried effortlessly over Jonathan's